Scrub Dog of Alaska by Walt Morey, 7. David's face was on fire when he reached home. He looked at himself in the mirror and was shocked. His mouth was bloody and swollen. A couple of front teeth felt loose. The whip had split the skin across the bridge of his nose and both cheeks. Blood oozed from the cut. An inch higher and he could have lost an eye, or both eyes. He washed his face in cold water. It helped, but it didn't stop the burning. He got a pan of snow and sat at the kitchen table, holding handfuls against the bruises. Gradually, the burning subsided. He studied his face again. He didn't want his parents to know what had happened. His father would half kill Jackson, and he'd be angry with David because of his stupid act. The swelling around his mouth would probably go down before his parents returned. Somewhere he'd read that loose teeth often tightened up again. The whip slash across his face bothered him most. That gash was too deep to heal in a hurry. It was going to be visible for some time. It would be well scabbed over, but it would look bad. David wondered if he'd have a scar like Jackson's. There'd be questions, particularly from his mother. He had to come up with a logical story. He considered saying that he slipped while carrying in wood and struck his face against the stove, but his mother would pick that story apart in no time. Maybe he could say a chunk had flown off the axe when he was cutting firewood. But chunks didn't fly when you were splitting block wood. Finally, he hit upon a story he was sure would do. While hiking through the brush, a limb snapped back and struck him across the face. That was logical. Even his father couldn't find fault with that one. At one time or another, it had happened to everyone who got out into the woods. He'd never known anyone getting such a deep gash that way. But, several times, he'd been stung enough to raise a welt. His cuts should be healed well enough by the time they returned, so they'd accept the story. The next day, David was back on the hill, crouched behind the rock. He watched Jackson and the team go by, heading home. Scrub seemed none the worse for his beating. David worked out a routine for his days. The daylight hours in winter were short, so there was little he could do outside. After breakfast, he did the dishes, cleaned up the kitchen, and made his bed. He spent an hour at the woodpile, splitting blocks and piling stove wood on the back porch. He wanted enough to last his mother the week he was gone. The snow was getting deep on the roof. He knocked off a lot with a long pole. Another day was spent clearing the snow off the doghouses. After that, he took hikes and did a lot of reading in the evening. He'd have gone to visit Nick and Jean at Aurora, but he didn't want them to see his face. One thing he never missed, the pilgrimage to the hill to watch Scrub go by. He was beginning to make a good lead dog, David told himself. In fact, the whole team was improving. It seemed they pulled the load of logs easier and faster. A dozen times a day, David studied his face in the mirror. The swelling was slowly disappearing. By the 5th day, his mouth, lips, and cheeks were back to normal. Surprisingly, the 2 teeth tightened again. The whip cuts were scabbed over, but they'd be much in evidence when his parents returned. It was evening on the 6th day, and he was reading in the kitchen when he heard the dogs. He threw open the door, and there was the team pulling up at the porch. His mother shouted happily, "David, hello, hello," and started climbing out of the basket. Then she saw his face. "What happened to you?" David told her about the hike and the snapping limb. "It hurt at first, but it's about healed up now." She looked closely. "I can imagine that was deep. You could have lost an eye or both eyes," his father asked. "What were you doing? Dreaming along?" I guess so. All I know is suddenly I got hit." "It's a wonder boys live to grow up," Fred said. "Keep your wits about you. A thing like that can be serious out here." He began to unhitch the team. "Anything happen while we were gone?" Everything was quiet. "You made out all right?" his mother asked. "You didn't get lonesome?" "A little, but it wasn't bad. How'd you do?" "I enjoyed it." She gathered up the rifle and blankets and went inside. David helped his father with the dogs. There had been no probing questions. They believed him. When the dogs were staked out, his father said, "You go on in. It's cold out here. I'll unload the sled." His mother was out of her parka and looking around the kitchen. Her cheeks were flushed from the cold. "You're a pretty good housekeeper. I can see I won't have to worry about coming home to a mess." "I took lessons from you. It's easier to keep house here than on the trail." "Much easier, but the trail is fun. It's such a change." She leaned against the sink and folded her arms. "Now let's have the truth about your face." He looked startled. "Mom, I told you." She shook her head. "It would have to be a very small limb to make such a narrow scab. A limb that small snapping would sting, but it wouldn't be strong enough to cut that deep. I should know. You do, and that's not it. Besides, you've never been a good liar. Now do I start guessing? He hadn't fooled her at all. I suppose you figured it out, he said. I can come close. I sneaked up to see Scrub and ran into Smiley Jackson. He told her quickly what had happened. She listened, her lips pulled into a straight line, her black eyes snapping. He had a right to run you off, Celia said angrily, but not to use a whip on you as if you were one of his dogs. For 2 cents, I'd go up there and scalp that drunken bum. Mom, David said, shocked. Well, that's what us Indians are famous for, isn't it? He could have blinded you for life. It's over. Let's just forget it. We'll have to, this time. We can't let your father know, but it better not happen again. Do you think Dad will guess? He asked, worried. He would if he paid close attention, but his mind's on trapping and fur. Besides, she smiled and her burst of anger blew away. Few fathers know their sons as well as I do you. Now I want your solemn promise to keep completely away from Jackson's place and Scrub, or I won't leave you here alone again. I promise, David said. All I did was get Scrub a beating, too. Fred rested a day during which he did a little work on the sled and repaired one of the dog's harnesses. The following day, he was ready to leave again, and it was David's turn to go along. Celia waved from the porch. You fellows be careful, she called. Sure, Fred answered. Keep the home fires burning. Dave left you plenty of wood. Fred again suggested David try handling the team. If we're going to lengthen this line, you run part of it. You've got to learn to handle a dog team. They're used to you, not me. Maybe I can't. Nonsense. 5-year-old kids have handled 3 dog teams in junior races. It's time you got over some of your timidity. You'll be doing a man's work next year, and we'll need a team. It was not that he was afraid, but he'd always seen men beside these big teams. To handle one would be like stepping out in competition with men. He didn't feel up to that. Come on, try it. Fred stepped off the runners, went around, and got in the basket. David took his stance on the runners and got a good grip on the handles. The team waited expectantly. Noble looked back at him. David made his voice as much like his father's as possible and yelled, Noble, let's go. The sled shot away. David lost his grip and tumbled into the stow. Fred shouted from the basket, Noble! When the big dog turned and came back to David. Get a tighter grip, his father advised. Lean forward on the sled starts. David took a firm grip and shouted. This time he was ready for the expected rush. The sled took off and he rode with it. This was different from riding bundled up in the basket. Every bump and imperfection in the trail came up through his feet and threatened to upset him. Wind shouldered against him. The sled drifted to the right, then to the left. This called for balance and all his strength. The forward speed of the sled and his precarious position forced him to stay alert. They made a sharp turn to avoid a hidden rock. He was not braced and fell again. He was dumped twice in the next hour. Then Fred took over. After that, David took his turn handling the team. By the 4th day, he felt fairly secure on the runners. The long, limber lash was the one thing he was unable to manage. It was hard to balance on the speeding runners and use the whip. He caught it on the brush, or the lash hit a rock or a stump. Sometimes he didn't swing his arm forward hard enough, or he hurried the swing because he'd almost lost his balance. Then the lash fell into the snow. Once, he actually hit himself. When it did curl over the dogs' backs, he had no idea where the end would pop. You need practice, Fred said. There's an old whip hanging on the wall of the fur house at home. Practice with that. Just remember, the idea is not to use the whip on the dogs. It's to keep them eager, to let them know you're behind them and have everything under control. It's a signal or warning if a fight's about to break out. When that happens, use the butt of the whip to break it up. David was handling the team when he pulled into Scotty's fifth night. David was handling the team when they pulled into Scotty's the 5th night. So, Scotty said, we've got a new musher. How are you doing, Davy? I don't know, Davy said. He's doing fine, Fred said. No problems he can't lick. Scotty helped them unhitch and stake out the dogs. They had almost finished when he asked, What did Jackson do with my friend Scrub? He's Jackson's lead dog, Fred said. You don't say. Scotty scratched his head with the hook and watched Fred unhitch the stake out and stake out the last dog. Got a hunch that dog could make a good leader, that is, if Jackson don't up and spoil him. Well, let's go inside before we freeze to death standing here. Once again, they pulled in at home with a good catch. Fred was happy. He said to Celia, "This is going to be a fine harvest, and you ought to see Dave handle the team. We'll pick up some more dogs next summer for him and lengthen the line." "You think David's ready?" he asked. "He's almost ready now. What do you say, David?" "I'd like it fine if I can do it," David said. "You will," Fred said. Fred spent his usual day at home and was ready to take off again. It was Celia's turn to go. She gave a warning look as she settled in the basket. "You be careful here." "I will," he promised. "Don't forget to practice with that old whip," Fred said, and they were off. David spent long hours with the whip. He carried it with him on hikes, popping it at twigs, stumps, rocks. Everything was a target. His accuracy increased until he could shatter an icicle hanging from the edge of the roof the full length of the whip away. Every day he climbed the hill to watch from behind the rock for Scrub and the team to struggle past with the load of logs. There was steady improvement. Scrub moved out with confidence and strength. He kept the team strung out. Now Jackson was letting him set his own pace. Scrub had a sharp eye for obstacles in the trail, and he tended strictly to business. Each day they passed around the base of the hill and disappeared, running fast and well. As much as he hated Jackson, David had to admit he was rounding the team into top racing condition. Toward the end of the week, the scab across his face dropped off. There was no scar. A month passed. David was home again. It was the last day he'd be alone, and he barely made the top of the hill to watch Scrub and the team. When he saw them, they were coming from a different direction. Their excited yapping drowned out Jackson's voice. They skimmed over the snow at a speed that he'd never seen before. Then, as they drew nearer, he saw why. The load of logs was gone. The dogs were running light and fast. They were happy. That meant Jackson considered the training period at an end. The team of dogs did not round the base of the hill and disappear as usual. This time the dogs turned sharply and headed straight out across the snow-blanketed tundra. For a moment David was surprised. Then he understood what the change of direction the light sled meant. Smiley Jackson was leaving Aurora. He was heading for the first of a series of small races that would give the team the experience of running in competition. Eventually, if they were lucky, they'd end up at the Fur Rendezvous in Anchorage, the North American Championships at Fairbanks, or both. David felt his throat grow dry. This was probably the last time he would ever see Scrub, even from a distance. His friend was going straight into a brittle sun that hung low on the horizon. David watched until his eyes watered. The team and Jackson became smaller and smaller until they were like a tiny Eskimo carving on the immense landscape. David could not distinguish Scrub at all. And that's the end of Chapter 7.